The conference room smelled like leather and old money. I was mid-sentence when Harrison Blackwell closed his folder with a sound like a judge's gavel.
He didn't look at me.
He just stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and said 4 words that ended my career. "We're done here, Agnes." The silence that followed was suffocating. 12 people sat around that mahogany table, executives, advisors, lawyers, and not one of them met my eyes. Harrison adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture I'd seen him make 1,000 times when he was about to deliver a killing blow in negotiations.
This time, I was the target.
"If you don't trust how I run my money, you don't belong in this room."
His voice was calm, almost gentle, which made it worse.
There was no anger, no emotion at all.
Just surgical precision.
"Security will help you gather your things."
Chairs scraped against marble floors.
People stood, closing laptops, avoiding eye contact. I sat frozen, my notebook still open to the page where I'd written my question. "Why does the Monaco transfer timing conflict with the quarterly reporting structure you approved last month?"
It wasn't an accusation. It was my job.
I was Harrison Blackwell's senior financial analyst, the person he'd personally hired 3 years ago specifically to ask questions nobody else would. Until today, that had been my greatest asset.
Heat crawled up my neck as I finally stood.
My hands didn't shake. I wouldn't give anyone that satisfaction. But inside, panic was building like pressure behind a dam. Harrison had already left through the private exit he always used. The others filed out the main doors, a few throwing sympathetic glances my way that meant nothing without action. I gathered my notebook slowly, deliberately. The question was still there in black ink, professional and precise. I'd spent 2 days verifying the discrepancy before bringing it up. I'd triple-checked my numbers. The Monaco account showed a transfer completion date of March 15th, but Harrison's approved timeline indicated March 22nd. 7 days might seem insignificant to most people, but in high-level finance, timing was everything. It affected tax obligations, regulatory reporting, and investment windows. My entire career had been built on catching these exact kinds of details. Harrison had praised me for it during my last review, had increased my salary by 40%, had introduced me to clients as the sharpest mind in wealth management I've ever worked with.
That was 6 weeks ago.
Now, apparently, sharp minds were a liability.
I walked out of the conference room into the hallway where 2 security guards waited.
Not the friendly ones who usually joked about the weather. These were stone-faced professionals who'd been briefed on a problem that needed removing. "Ms. Whitfield," the taller one said, his voice professionally neutral. "We'll escort you to your office." No one spoke as we walked through the 42nd floor of Blackwell Capital Management. The walls were glass, everything transparent except the secrets. People at their desks pretended to work while watching my walk of shame from the corners of their eyes.
I'd seen this happen before to others. The quiet dismissal. The security escort. The whispers that would start the moment I was gone. My office was small but had a view of the harbor. I'd earned that view through 3 years of 80-hour weeks and catching financial irregularities that had saved Harrison millions. Now I had 15 minutes to pack it all up. I pulled out the cardboard box that every fired employee seems to find magically waiting on their desk. Someone had anticipated this.
Someone had prepared for my removal before I'd even asked my question. That realization hit harder than Harrison's dismissal. The guard stood at my door, blocking anyone from entering or me from wandering. I packed my personal items methodically, the photo of my late mother, 3 industry awards, a jade plant that had survived 2 years of fluorescent lighting. My diplomas from Princeton stayed on the wall, not mine to take.
My name placard went in the trash.
My company laptop sat on the desk, screen dark. I'd spent 3 years building financial models on that machine, creating systems that tracked Harrison's complex web of investments across 17 countries. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, muscle memory wanting to log in one last time. But I knew better. Security would be monitoring. IT had probably already revoked my access. "The laptop stays," the shorter guard said, confirming my suspicion. I nodded and closed the box. 15 minutes had become 12. I took one last look at the harbor view, at the city where I'd built my reputation as someone meticulous and trustworthy. By tomorrow, the Whisper network would paint me as difficult, as someone who'd overstepped, as a cautionary tale about biting the hand that feeds you. The elevator ride down was silent. Both guards accompanied me all the way to the lobby, past the reception desk where I'd entered every morning for 3 years, past the security checkpoint that knew my face. The revolving door spat me out onto the street at 2:37 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon.
Too early for the evening rush. Too late for lunch crowds. Just me, a cardboard box, and a career in ruins. I stood on the sidewalk, blinking in the bright sunlight, and realized I had nowhere urgent to be for the first time in years. My name is Agnes Whitfield, and until 30 minutes ago, I was one of the most trusted financial analysts in private wealth management. I didn't work for just anyone. Harrison Blackwell's net worth exceeded $4 billion, spread across ventures so complex that most financial professionals couldn't track them. He owned shipping companies, real estate portfolios, technology startups, and investments in industries I'd needed to research just to understand. My job was to be his financial conscience. To ask the questions that made him uncomfortable. To spot the patterns that others missed. To protect him from his own blind spots and from advisors who might take advantage of his trust. He'd told me that himself during my interview 3 years ago. Agnes, he'd said, leaning back in his chair in this very building, I don't need another yes person. I need someone who'll tell me when something doesn't add up. Can you do that? I'd said yes. I'd meant it. And for 3 years, it had worked perfectly. I'd caught accounting errors that could have triggered audits. I'd identified investment opportunities his other advisors missed. I'd saved him from 3 separate fraud attempts by vendors who thought they could slip false invoices past his team. He'd rewarded me with raises, bonuses, and increasing access to his most sensitive financial information. I knew things about Harrison Blackwell's money that his own lawyers didn't know. Until today, that knowledge had been my greatest professional asset. Now, standing on the street with my box of belongings, I realized it might be the only asset I had left. I took the subway home, something I hadn't done in months. Harrison's company had provided car service for senior analysts. That was gone now too, along with my health insurance, my 401k matching, and my reputation. The woman sitting across from me on the train stared at my cardboard box with knowing sympathy. She'd been there too, her expression said. My apartment was quiet when I got home at 3:15. I set the box on my kitchen counter and stared at it. 3 years of career reduced to personal items that fit in 18 inches of cardboard. My phone sat silent in my pocket. No calls from former colleagues. No texts asking if I was okay. The isolation was immediate and absolute. I made coffee I didn't drink and sat at my kitchen table, replaying the conference room scene in my head. Harrison's face when I'd asked about the Monaco timing. The way his expression had gone blank, like a door closing. The instant shift from mentor to stranger. What had I missed? What had my question revealed that I hadn't understood? The Monaco account was one of Harrison's oldest holdings, established before I'd joined the company. I'd only gained access to it 6 months ago when he'd expanded my clearance levels. I pulled out my personal laptop, the one that had nothing to do with Blackwell Capital, and opened my email. Force of habit made me check my work account first. Access denied. They'd moved faster than I'd expected. My work email was already dead, my credentials wiped from the system. But then I noticed something. My access to the financial modeling software we used, a third-party platform called FinanceTrack Pro, was still active. It was a system I'd helped implement 2 years ago, setting up Harrison's entire portfolio architecture. The login wasn't tied to my work email. It was linked to my personal account, the one I'd used during the initial setup and never changed. I hesitated, my cursor hovering over the login button. Accessing it now, after being fired, crossed an ethical line. But I also knew that my access would be terminated eventually. IT just hadn't gotten to it yet in the chaos of my removal. I logged in. The dashboard loaded with all of Harrison's accounts displayed in the organized structure I'd created. 17 countries. 43 separate entities. Hundreds of millions of dollars in active transactions. It was beautiful in its complexity, a financial web that I'd spent 3 years understanding and maintaining. I pulled up the Monaco account and stared at the transfer I'd questioned. March 15th. The money had moved a full week before the approved timeline indicated it should. I dug deeper, pulling up the approval documentation. Harrison's signature was there, dated February 10th, clearly stating the transfer would execute on March 22nd. But the actual transfer had happened on March 15th. 7 days early. Someone had jumped the timeline. The question was, who had the authority to do that, and why? I cross-referenced the Monaco account with others in Harrison's portfolio, looking for patterns. It took me an hour of searching, but I found them. 3 other accounts showing the same discrepancy. Transfers executing days before or after their approved timelines. Small shifts, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. But I'd been trained to look. My phone rang, making me jump. Unknown number.
I almost didn't answer, then changed my mind at the last second. Hello. Agnes Whitfield. A woman's voice, professional and cautious. Speaking. This is Officer Brennan from Building Security at Blackwell Capital.
We need you to return your security badge.
You can drop it at the front desk tomorrow.
Of course.
Another severed connection. I'll bring it by in the morning. Thank you.
She hung up without ceremony.
I looked at my badge, still clipped to my jacket. 3 years of clearance to the most exclusive building in the financial district, now just plastic to be returned.
I set it on the table next to my cold coffee. The rest of the week passed in surreal slowness. No job offers appeared. The financial community was small, and word traveled fast. I'd been dismissed by Harrison Blackwell himself. That mark would follow me regardless of the real reason. People would assume I'd done something wrong, something serious enough to warrant immediate removal. I kept my access to Finance Track Pro, checking it each morning to see if IT had finally killed my login. But days passed, and it remained active. Either they'd forgotten about the third-party system, or they assumed I wouldn't dare access it after being fired. I continued my analysis, driven by something I couldn't quite name. Curiosity, maybe, or the need to prove to myself that my question had been valid. The pattern became clearer with each account I examined. Transfers moving outside their approved windows. Not by much, usually just a few days, but consistent enough to be deliberate. Someone was manipulating Harrison's money, and they were doing it with enough subtlety that only someone intimately familiar with the approved timelines would notice. On Thursday, I received a call from my former colleague, Timothy Wu. We'd worked together for 2 years before he'd moved to a different firm. Agnes, I heard what happened. Are you okay? Define okay, I said, grateful to hear a friendly voice. I mean, Harrison Blackwell doesn't just fire people. What did you do? I asked a question. Timothy was silent for a moment. Must have been quite a question. It was routine.
Transfer timing didn't match approved documentation.
Another pause.
And he fired you for that.
Immediately. No warning, no conversation.
Just dismiss me in front of the entire advisory board. That's not normal, Timothy said slowly. Harrison's known for being demanding, but he's usually fair. Something else is going on there. I know, I said, staring at my laptop screen where Harrison's accounts were still displayed. I just don't know what. After Timothy hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling the walls close in. I needed to get out, needed to think about something other than the financial puzzle that was consuming me. But every time I tried to focus on job applications or networking, my mind drifted back to those transfer discrepancies. The weekend came and went.
No calls. No emails. The silence was deafening.
Monday morning arrived, and I was drinking coffee when my phone rang. Unknown number again, but different from the security call. I answered cautiously. Hello. Ms. Whitfield? This is Carolyn Vasquez from Sterling Private Bank. The voice was professional, with an edge of nervousness I recognized immediately.
Something was wrong. My pulse quickened.
Sterling Private Bank handled some of Harrison's European accounts. I'd never spoken to them directly. Harrison's lawyers usually managed that relationship. Yes, this is Agnes. We're calling regarding the Blackwell portfolio accounts we manage. We understand you're Mr. Blackwell's senior financial analyst.
I said carefully.
I'm no longer with Blackwell Capital.
The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds too long.
I see. When did your employment end? Last Tuesday.
More silence.
I could hear papers rustling, someone's muffled voice in the background. Ms. Whitfield, I apologize for the confusion. Our records still listed you as the primary technical contact for portfolio oversight. We weren't informed of any changes.
Primary technical contact.
That was a designation I'd held for 18 months, ever since Harrison had expanded my role to include direct coordination with his international banking relationships. Apparently, in his haste to remove me, no one had thought to update those external contacts. What can I help you with? I asked, my mind already racing with possibilities. We're conducting our quarterly compliance review, Carolyn said, her nervousness more evident now. There are some questions about transfer authorizations and timing that we need clarification on. Normally we'd go through Mr. Blackwell's office, but the documentation we have lists you as the verification contact.
The transfer timing. My question from the conference room.
It wasn't just an internal discrepancy, it was triggering compliance flags at the banks themselves. What specifically are you questioning? I asked, keeping my tone professional despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Several transfers from the Luxembourg holdings executed outside their approved windows. Our compliance team flagged them during the routine audit. We need to understand if these were authorized variations or if there's been a processing error. I pulled my laptop closer, logging into Finance Track Pro while she talked. The Luxembourg accounts loaded on my screen. There they were, 3 transfers, each one moving funds days before their documented approval dates. The timing variations aren't documented in our files, I said slowly. The approvals I have on record don't match the execution dates you're showing.
Carolyn's voice tightened.
That's what we were afraid of. Ms. Whitfield, this creates a significant compliance issue for us. We execute transfers based on authorized timelines. If those timelines were modified without proper documentation, we need to understand why and by whom.
I understand, I said, my mind working through the implications.
If Sterling Private Bank was finding discrepancies, other banks would too. Harrison's entire financial structure could be under scrutiny, all because of the question I'd asked last Tuesday. Is there any way you could review the documentation we have and compare it to your records?
Carolyn asked. We need to resolve this quickly.
Our auditors are scheduled to complete their review by end of week.
I should have said no.
I should have referred her back to Blackwell Capital, to the people who'd escorted me out with security guards and erased my access. But something made me pause.
This wasn't about revenge or vindication. This was about the truth of what I'd discovered.
I can review what you have, I said carefully. But I need to be clear, I'm no longer employed by Mr. Blackwell. Any consultation would need to be in my personal capacity.
We understand.
We can arrange a consulting fee for your time.
A consulting fee? For answering questions about the same discrepancies that had gotten me fired. The irony was almost beautiful.
Send me what you have, I said, giving her my personal email address.
The files arrived within the hour.
Carolyn had included transfer authorizations, execution confirmations, and the timeline documentation that Sterling Private Bank had on file. I spread it all across my screen and compared it to the data I still had access to through Finance Track Pro.
The discrepancies were undeniable.
Every transfer that Sterling had executed matched dates that were different from the approvals Harrison had signed. Someone had modified the execution timelines after Harrison's approval but before the transfers processed. The question was, who had that level of access? I created a spreadsheet, documenting each discrepancy with timestamps and authorization codes.
The pattern became clearer with each entry.
The modifications always happened in the 3-day window between Harrison's approval and the scheduled transfer date. That meant someone in Harrison's inner circle. Someone with access to the authorization system.
Someone he trusted. My phone rang again.
Carolyn Vasquez, calling back after only 2 hours. Ms. Whitfield, we've just been contacted by 2 other banks with similar questions. Clement Trust in Switzerland and Pacific Rim Holdings in Singapore. Both found the same timeline discrepancies in their quarterly reviews.
3 banks, all finding the same problem.
This wasn't a simple error, this was systematic manipulation happening across Harrison's entire international portfolio. What does Mr. Blackwell say about this?
I asked.
We haven't been able to reach him directly. His office says he's unavailable and referred us to his chief legal counsel. But the legal team doesn't have the technical knowledge to answer our questions.
They keep asking for you. Of course they did.
Because I was the one who'd built the systems, who'd created the documentation protocols, who understood how every piece of Harrison's financial architecture connected. Harrison had eliminated me without considering that the banks would still need someone who could explain the technical details. The modifications were made inside the authorization window, I said, walking Carolyn through my findings. After Mr. Blackwell approved the transfers but before they executed. Whoever did this had high-level system access and knowledge of the approval workflow. Can you identify who made the changes? I pulled up the authorization logs, something I'd helped design 2 years ago specifically for this kind of forensic analysis. Each modification had a user stamp, a digital signature showing who'd made the change.
My breath caught.
Ms. Whitfield.
Carolyn prompted.
The modifications were made by someone using Mr. Blackwell's own login credentials, I said slowly. But the timestamps show these changes happened during times when Mr. Blackwell was documented to be in other meetings or locations. Someone using his credentials without authorization.
Or someone he authorized to use them.
Either way, It's a serious security breach.
Carolyn was quiet for a moment.
I could hear her breathing, processing the implications. We need to halt all pending transfers until this is resolved. We can't execute transactions if we don't have confidence in the authorization chain. That would freeze millions of dollars in pending transactions. It would trigger immediate attention from Harrison's entire financial team. It would force them to confront exactly what I'd been trying to point out in that conference room. I understand, I said. That's the prudent choice.
After she hung up, I sat staring at my screen.
The user who'd made the modifications was listed as HB admin, Harrison Blackwell's administrative account. But Harrison himself couldn't have made these changes. The timestamps proved it. Someone else had access to his master credentials.
Tuesday morning, my phone started ringing constantly.
First Sterling Private Bank again, then Clement Trust, then Pacific Rim Holdings. Each one asking the same questions, each one discovering more timeline discrepancies, each one freezing transactions until they understood what was happening. I fielded each call professionally, providing technical explanations and referring them to the documentation I'd compiled. With each conversation, I felt the power dynamic shifting. These banks didn't care that Harrison had fired me. They cared that I had answers they needed. At 10:15, a new number appeared. I recognized the area code, Blackwell Capital's main line. Ms. Whitfield, this is Pierce Thornton, Harrison's chief legal counsel, a man I'd met dozens of times.
His voice was tense.
We need to discuss the communications you've been having with our banking partners.
They called me, I said calmly.
I was still listed as technical contact. Your employment ended last week.
Nobody informed the banks of that. Silence.
Then, we need you to cease all communications with our financial institutions immediately. You're no longer authorized to represent Blackwell Capital's interests.
I'm not representing Blackwell Capital, I said.
I'm providing independent technical consultation to banks that have compliance questions. They are paying me directly for my time. I could hear Pierce's breathing change, that sharp intake that meant he was getting angry. You're interfering with confidential financial matters.
I'm answering questions about systems I designed and discrepancies I documented.
If Mr. Blackwell has concerns about that, perhaps he should have considered the implications before dismissing me without transition planning.
This conversation is over, Pierce said.
Expect contact from our attorneys regarding breach of confidentiality.
He hung up before I could respond.
Empty threats, probably, but they revealed something important. Harrison's team was panicking. The freeze on transfers was costing them money and raising questions they couldn't answer. My next call came from Carolyn Vasquez again, but this time her voice was different.
Harder.
Ms. Whitfield, I need to be direct with you. We've escalated this matter to our executive team. The pattern of unauthorized timeline modifications represents a serious compliance violation. We're required to report this to regulatory authorities. Regulatory authorities. That meant government investigators, formal inquiries, potential legal action. Harrison's private financial matters were about to become very public.
I understand, I said.
Would like to retain you as a formal consultant for this investigation. We need someone who understands the technical systems and can help us document exactly what happened. Would you be willing?
It was the question I'd been waiting for without realizing it.
Official consultant status meant protection, legitimacy, and compensation. It meant my involvement was professional, not personal revenge.
Yes, I said.
I'll send you my consulting agreement. By Wednesday, the situation had exploded beyond my apartment walls. Sterling Private Bank had formally notified Harrison's legal team that they were conducting an internal investigation into transaction authorization procedures. Clement Trust and Pacific Rim Holdings followed suit within hours. 3 major banks simultaneously questioning the integrity of Harrison Blackwell's financial operations. My consulting agreement with Sterling was signed by end of business Tuesday. They paid my retainer Wednesday morning, $15,000 for the first week of work. More money than I'd make in a month at Blackwell Capital, deposited into my account while my former employer scrambled to contain a crisis they'd created by silencing me. I worked from my apartment, reviewing transaction logs, building timelines, documenting every discrepancy I found.
The pattern was extensive.
Over the past 18 months, more than 40 transfers had been modified from their approved timelines. The changes were small enough to avoid immediate attention but significant enough to affect tax reporting, regulatory compliance, and investment timing. Someone had been systematically manipulating Harrison's transactions. And they'd been doing it using his own credentials. Thursday afternoon, Timothy Wu called again.
Agnes, what the hell is happening?
The entire industry is buzzing about Harrison Blackwell facing bank investigations. Compliance reviews, I corrected. Standard procedure when discrepancies are found.
Discrepancies you found.
Discrepancies that existed regardless of who found them.
Timothy laughed, but it sounded nervous.
You asked one question in a meeting, got fired for it, and now his entire financial structure is under scrutiny. That's not coincidence.
No, I agreed.
It's consequence.
Friday morning brought the call I'd been half expecting and half dreading.
Unknown number, but when I answered, the voice was unmistakable. Agnes. Harrison Blackwell himself, his tone controlled but with an undercurrent of something I'd never heard before.
Uncertainty.
We need to talk. Do we? This situation with the banks is getting out of hand. They are freezing legitimate transactions over minor procedural questions.
Timeline modifications aren't minor, I said.
And they are not procedural. Someone's been changing your transfer dates after you approve them.
I'm aware. His voice tightened.
That's what we need to discuss.
In person. Today.
I don't work for you anymore, Harrison. You made that very clear.
I'm not asking you to work for me.
I'm asking you to meet with me and help resolve this mess before it damages both of us. Both of us. As if we were equally at risk. As if I hadn't been publicly humiliated and erased for asking the exact question that had triggered this crisis. I'm consulting for Sterling Private Bank now, I said. Any discussion we have would need to include their compliance team. The silence lasted long enough that I thought he'd hung up.
Then, fine.
Can you arrange that for Monday?
I'll ask.
After he disconnected, I sat holding my phone, trying to process what had just happened. Harrison Blackwell, the man who dismissed me without a second thought, was now asking for my help. The power had shifted so completely that he couldn't even give me orders anymore.
I called Carolyn Vasquez. Harrison wants a meeting. Monday.
He's willing to include your compliance team.
That's a good sign, Carolyn said.
It means he's taking this seriously now. Will you attend? If you want me there.
We absolutely want you there.
You're the only person who understands the technical systems well enough to ask the right questions.
The irony was perfect. Asking questions had gotten me fired. Now asking questions was exactly why they needed me.
The weekend passed in preparation. I compiled reports, organized documentation, created visual timelines showing every modified transaction. By Sunday evening, I had a presentation that laid out the entire pattern of manipulation in undeniable detail. Monday morning, I dressed in my best suit, the one I'd bought for client presentations back when I'd had a corporate job. I took a car service to Sterling Private Bank's offices, a gesture of professional legitimacy I hadn't been able to afford last week. Carolyn met me in the lobby, along with 2 other compliance officers and the bank's chief risk officer, a stern woman named Barbara Kent. Mr. Blackwell and his legal team are in conference room A, Carolyn said. Are you ready? Yes. The conference room was smaller than the one at Blackwell Capital but just as carefully appointed. Harrison sat at the head of the table, looking older than he had just 9 days ago. Pierce Thornton was next to him, along with 2 other lawyers I didn't recognize. They all stood when we entered, a show of professional respect that felt absurd given the circumstances.
Harrison's eyes met mine. No apology in them, but acknowledgement at least. Agnes. Thank you for coming. I nodded but didn't return the pleasantry.
Carolyn handled the introductions, establishing the formal nature of the meeting. This wasn't a friendly discussion. This was an investigation. Barbara Kent took control immediately. Mr. Blackwell, we've documented 43 instances over 18 months where transfers from your accounts executed outside their approved timelines. These modifications happened after your approval but before execution. Can you explain why?
Harrison's jaw tightened.
I wasn't aware of the modifications until this week. The changes were made using your administrative credentials. Someone else had access to those credentials. Who?
Barbara's question was sharp, demanding.
Harrison looked at Pierce, who cleared his throat. We're conducting an internal investigation to determine that. The access logs are being reviewed.
I spoke for the first time.
The access logs show the modifications were made from IP addresses inside Blackwell Capital's network.
Office computers, not remote access.
Whoever did this worked in your building. Harrison's face went pale. You've seen the access logs.
I designed the logging system, I reminded him. I know how to read it.
Barbara looked at me, then back to Harrison. Ms. Whitfield has provided us with detailed forensic analysis. The timeline modifications follow a pattern. They consistently moved money earlier or later in ways that affected tax obligations and regulatory reporting periods.
Someone was tax shifting, I said, filling in what Barbara was implying.
Moving transactions across fiscal boundaries to minimize tax exposure or hide activity from quarterly reports.
Harrison's hands clenched on the table.
That's a serious accusation.
It's a documented pattern, I replied calmly.
Whether it was intentional or not, that's what happened.
Pierce leaned forward.
We need time to investigate our internal systems before drawing conclusions.
You have until Friday, Barbara said.
That's when we're required to file our compliance report with regulatory authorities. If you can identify who made these modifications and why, it will affect how we characterize the situation.
The meeting lasted another hour, but the essential message was clear. Harrison had 5 days to figure out who'd been manipulating his money, or the banks would report it as potential fraud. As we filed out of the conference room, Harrison caught my arm.
Agnes, I need to apologize.
I looked at his hand on my sleeve until he released it. For what specifically? Firing me without cause? Using security to escort me out?
Damaging my reputation. For not listening when you tried to warn me.
I wasn't warning you. I was asking a question. That was my job. I know.
He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd seen countless times.
I reacted badly.
I was protecting something I shouldn't have been protecting. Who had access to your credentials?
I asked directly.
Harrison glanced around the empty hallway, then lowered his voice.
My nephew.
Kyle manages my technology infrastructure. He's had administrative access for 2 years.
Kyle Blackwell.
I'd met him 3 times, always in passing. Young, confident, with an MBA from Stanford and the easy arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. He'd been dismissive of my financial systems, had suggested multiple times that I was overcomplicating things. He modified the transfers.
I asked.
I think so. But I need to prove it before accusing him. The logs will prove it if you look.
Harrison's expression hardened. His family, Agnes.
I can't just throw him to investigators without being certain.
And there it was. The real reason I'd been fired.
I'd asked a question that implicated someone Harrison wanted to protect. Better to eliminate me than face the possibility that his own nephew was manipulating his fortune.
The banks will find the truth with or without your help, I said.
The only question is whether you control the narrative or they do.
I walked away before he could respond. Carolyn was waiting by the elevators.
That looked intense.
He knows who did it.
He's just not ready to admit it publicly. Will he before Friday? That depends on whether he values family loyalty more than his reputation.
The answer came Wednesday afternoon. Pierce Thornton called my personal line.
Agnes, we've completed our internal investigation. We're prepared to provide documentation to Sterling Private Bank showing that the timeline modifications were made by Kyle Blackwell without Harrison's knowledge or authorization. Is Harrison pressing charges?
No.
Kyle has agreed to resign from all positions in Blackwell Capital and repay any tax advantages gained from the modified timelines. In exchange, we're characterizing this as an internal personnel matter rather than criminal activity.
A cover-up, wrapped in corporate language.
Kyle would face consequences, but not the kind that involved prosecutors or prison time. Harrison was protecting him, just not at the cost of his own reputation. Will this satisfy the banks?
I asked.
We believe so. We're providing full documentation of Kyle's access, the timeline modifications, and our remediation plan. Harrison wants this resolved quietly.
Of course he does.
There's one more thing.
Pierce's voice changed, became almost conciliatory.
Harrison would like to offer you a settlement. Compensation for the manner of your termination and acknowledgement that your concerns were valid.
The settlement offer arrived via email an hour later.
6 months of salary, a neutral reference letter, and a confidentiality agreement that would prevent me from discussing the circumstances of my dismissal or the investigation.
I read it twice, then called Timothy Wu.
They are offering hush money.
How much? I told him. He whistled.
That's not hush money, Agnes.
That's guilt money. Take it.
It comes with an NDA.
So?
You already have consulting income from the banks. Take Harrison's money, sign his paper, and move on.
You won.
Don't get greedy. He was right, but something about signing away my right to talk about what had happened felt wrong. Then again, I'd already proven my point. The banks knew the truth. Harrison knew the truth. Kyle was facing consequences, even if they were private ones.
I signed the settlement agreement and sent it back.
Thursday morning, Sterling Private Bank called with their final decision. We're closing our compliance investigation with a finding of internal control failure. Mr. Blackwell has provided adequate remediation steps. Your consulting contract is complete. What about regulatory reporting? We've filed the required documentation, but characterized it as a resolved matter rather than ongoing concern. Unless other issues emerge, this should be the end of it.
The end of it. 2 weeks ago, I'd been fired for asking a question.
Now the question was answered, the guilty party identified, and my bank account had more money in it than I'd saved in 3 years of corporate work.
I hung up the phone and looked around my apartment.
The cardboard box from my firing still sat on the kitchen counter, unpacked. I'd left it there as a reminder, but now it just looked sad. I dumped the contents into proper storage and broke down the box for recycling.
My phone rang one last time. Unknown number, but I answered anyway.
Ms. Whitfield? This is Helena Price from Whitmore Financial Group. We're a boutique wealth management firm specializing in high net worth clients.
Your name came up in our search for a chief compliance officer.
Would you be interested in discussing the position? A job offer.
From a firm that valued questions instead of punishing them.
Yes, I said. I'd be very interested. 3 weeks later, I started my new job at Whitmore Financial Group. My title was Chief Compliance Officer, and my primary responsibility was exactly what it had been before, asking questions that made people uncomfortable. The difference was that here, uncomfortable questions were considered essential, not threatening.
Harrison Blackwell and I never spoke again.
I saw his name occasionally in financial news, always accompanied by his carefully maintained reputation as a brilliant investor. Kyle's departure from the company was noted in a brief press release that attributed it to pursuing other opportunities. The truth stayed buried under confidentiality agreements and corporate discretion. But I'd learned something valuable. People who fear questions aren't protecting power. They're exposing weakness. And when systems depend on silence, the quiet ones always end up holding the leverage. I'd been fired for asking why a transfer timing didn't match documentation. That question had unraveled a scheme, exposed fraud, and ultimately landed me in a better position than I'd started. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is simply ask, why?